The year was 1843, and the Mississippi Delta lay suffocating beneath a sky the color of bleached linen. Blackwood Plantation did not merely sit upon the land, it seemed to leech the life and air from it. A grand edifice of faded white paint and imposing Greek Revival columns, it suggested permanence and prosperity. Yet anyone who stood still long enough could feel the decay creeping beneath the stucco, muffled by the relentless humidity. The vast fields of cotton stretched out like a blinding white ocean, patrolled by the rhythmic, heavy movement of the enslaved labor gang. The only sounds were the distant mechanical groan of the gin press and the ceaseless high-pitched thrum of cicadas, a noise so constant it became the very silence of the South. Inside the mansion, the air was thicker, weighed down by the smell of aged, polished mahogany and the faint, unsettling scent of old lavender. Augustus Blackwood, the master, was usually an invisible presence, often traveling to Natchez or New Orleans to settle the complex finances of his extensive empire. His absence was meant to be a relief, but for Mistress Charlotte Blackwood, it was a slow, agonizing erosion. Charlotte, 39 years old, sat rigidly upright in the withdrawing room, though the room held nothing that required her attention save the sluggish descent of dust motes in the angled afternoon light. She was a woman built for the gallant wit of a New Orleans drawing-room, not the savage, isolated monotony of the Delta. Her dress, though impeccably structured, seemed heavy upon her shoulders, a symbolic weight. Her face, still beautiful, was masked by a perpetual exhaustion that had nothing to do with labor and everything to do with absence, the absence of affection, the absence of a future. The great unspoken wound of Blackwood Plantation was the lack of an heir. Augustus, a man whose pride was as rigid as the ledger book he consulted nightly, could never admit to the whispers, which had solidified into a cold, terrifying knowledge within the household, that he was sterile. This secret shame, compounded by the failure of their marriage, had built an impenetrable wall between Augustus and Charlotte years ago, leaving her a gilded prisoner whose only duty was to maintain the facade. Their only child, Eleanor, was 20, a creature of fierce, untamed energy trapped within the constraints of her sex and station. Eleanor found the oppressive silence of the house intolerable. She was currently perched on the window seat of the second-floor hall, her slender hands clutching a book of poetry she wasn't reading. Her eyes, the same unnervingly pale gray as her mother's, were not fixed on the poem, but rather on the activity below the east porch, where the household staff moved with the quiet efficiency born of generations of fear. Eleanor did not fear her father, not precisely. She feared his cold disapproval, his ability to define her existence. This fear translated into a restless, subtle defiance, a readiness to break the rules that defined her gilded cage. Today, Eleanor's gaze was fixed on Caleb. Caleb, 29, was a house slave, though his position was unusual. Designated as the plantation's primary carpenter and craftsman, he possessed a quiet, deep intelligence honed by a previous, far more liberal master who had taught him to read and calculate before Augustus acquired him. This knowledge was hidden deep beneath a flawless exterior of compliance. His hands, perpetually stained with sawdust and linseed oil, were remarkable, strong, long-fingered, capable of the most intricate joinery. When he moved through the plantation house, repairing a loose baluster or fitting a new pane of glass, he seemed to possess an awareness that transcended his immediate task. He was meticulous, efficient, and almost wholly invisible, which was precisely how he had survived the cold scrutiny of Augustus for so long. He was currently installing new shelving units in the plantation's oversized, rarely used library, a task Augustus had decreed necessary to hold the growing volumes of agricultural and legal texts. The library was a cool refuge, lined with dark, imposing oak, smelling of old parchment and dry paper, a place where Charlotte often retreated. Charlotte, seeking escape from the suffocating air of the parlor, drifted into the library. She did not look at Caleb, who was standing on a low stool, carefully adjusting a brass support bracket, his silhouette sharp against the dusty light filtering through the high window. The sound of his plane shaving a sliver of wood was the only noise besides the distant cicadas, a rhythmic, precise sound, a sound of creation and focused attention. Charlotte moved to the window overlooking the vast, oppressive sprawl of cotton, folding her hands tightly at her waist. Caleb paused his work, his breath held. He knew the protocol, total silence unless addressed. Yet he was acutely aware of the woman near the window. He noted the slight involuntary tremor in her hands, the way she seemed to be breathing shallowly, as if oxygen itself were too heavy. The room was tense, not with heat, but with the pressure of two isolated human beings existing in proximity, both victims of the same sterile, unfeeling architecture. He placed the plane carefully on the cloth covering the floorboards, the small sound echoing unnaturally in the cavernous space. He lowered himself and began sorting the different screws needed for the next phase, his head bowed. Charlotte, believing herself alone in her solitude, finally sighed, a sound thin and weary like the rustle of dead leaves. "It will be years before those shelves are filled," Charlotte said, her voice low, directed not at him, but at the dust motes. "My husband purchases books only for appearance, not for study." Caleb kept his gaze fixed on the brass fittings, his face a perfect mask of neutrality. This was a dangerous line, a criticism of the master offered to a slave. But his intellect, which yearned for engagement, betrayed him. "Master Blackwood is a practical man, mistress," Caleb replied, his voice soft, pitched just above a whisper, respectful, yet possessing a clarity and articulation that belied the subservience of the Delta accent. "He purchases the tools of knowledge, even if he chooses not to use them. That perhaps is safer than using them wrongly." Charlotte turned from the window fully, her eyes widening infinitesimally. Surprised not only by the response but by the inherent complexity of the observation, she had been accustomed to silence or to simple reflexive agreement. Caleb met her gaze for a brief, dangerous moment, a look not of servitude, but of shared, albeit unequal, recognition. In that shared glance, a tiny, almost imperceptible crack formed in the impenetrable wall of plantation hierarchy. The atmosphere in the library did not lighten. It merely deepened, growing dense with unspoken context. Charlotte held her posture, studying Caleb, noticing the smooth dark line of his jaw, the careful set of his shoulders, ready to retract, ready to disappear entirely back into the functional invisibility required of him. Her initial question had been rhetorical, a statement born of her own frustrated inertia, yet his measured reply, safer than using them wrongly, had snapped her out of her stupor. A profound stillness settled, broken only by the microscopic rustle of the dry palm fronds outside the window, brushed by a barely existent breeze. Caleb slowly lifted his gaze from the collection of screws, his expression unchanged. Yet his eyes held a quick flash of awareness, a spark that recognized her loneliness and, startlingly, reflected his own. "Safer for whom, Caleb?" she pressed, stepping 2 paces closer, forcing him to acknowledge her presence fully. The name, articulated softly by her tongue, sounded unfamiliar and intimate in the echoing silence of the room. He swallowed hard, the slight movement of his Adam's apple the only sign of his internal struggle. His eyes swept across the wide, empty room, instinctively checking for doors or distant footsteps. He lowered his voice even further, pitching it below the threshold of the oppressive cicada drone outside. "For the house, mistress. A house built on a flawed foundation is best left undisturbed." He returned to his work, the very act of focusing on the wood a physical defense mechanism. Charlotte did not move away. She saw then the book. It was tucked almost invisibly beneath a length of heavy canvas, draped over a dismantled shelf section, its binding worn smooth, small enough to be concealed easily. It was not a text on carpentry. Its edges suggested poetry, perhaps philosophy. A slow, cool sense of comprehension dawned. Her previous master, a man of liberal inclinations, had done more than teach him measurements and joints. He had given Caleb the keys to a kingdom of thought, a kingdom fiercely forbidden in the Mississippi Delta. This realization instantly elevated Caleb from a skilled laborer to a shared conspirator in an internal world that Augustus Blackwood neither understood nor tolerated. "What is that volume?" Charlotte inquired, her tone shifting from inquisitorial to conspiratorial. Caleb's hands froze on the wood. He knew this moment was the precipice. Discovery, even of a book, was dangerous. Refusal to answer the mistress was impossible. He gently pulled the cloth back, revealing a tattered copy of Lord Byron's Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, its cover darkened with use. "It is a remnant, mistress, from the library of the previous master. I use the pages sometimes for calculations." Charlotte knew he was lying, beautifully and minimally. She knew the rhythm of the lines, the sweeping, despairing romanticism of Byron's voice. She reached out, her fingers brushing the spine of the book, a touch that was perhaps too lingering, too close to the fingers that held it. "There is a pleasure in the pathless woods," she quoted, her voice husky. "There is a rapture on the lonely shore." She lifted her eyes, and this time the recognition between them was undeniable, two souls exiled in the same suffocating landscape, one by marriage, the other by birthright. Over the next 8 months, the library became their silent refuge. Their interactions were subtle, masked by the demands of the plantation schedule. Caleb would always be working on a long-term project in the East Wing or the outbuildings, giving Charlotte an excuse to check on the inventory or supervise repairs. Indeed, the oppressive heat of late summer bled into the cool, damp breath of autumn, and the quality of light shifted from harsh white to a soft golden yellow that filtered through the high-arched windows. They never spoke of Augustus, nor of their individual fears, but their conversations, always hushed and punctuated by the fear of detection, spanned entire worlds. Caleb spoke of the concepts of natural law and intrinsic human dignity, ideas he carefully phrased as theoretical, historical points. Charlotte, in turn, spoke of her disillusionment with society, of the expectations placed on women, of the profound, aching emptiness of her life. One evening, as the shadows lengthened and the plantation bells signaled the end of the workday, Caleb was putting away his tools. Charlotte was standing near the fireplace, ostensibly checking a candelabra. The room was bathed in the gentle, wavering light of a single tallow candle, casting their profiles into sharp relief against the dark wood. The faint scent of wood smoke from the chimney mingled with the sharp tang of the evening air that now flowed in through the cracked window. "Caleb," she began, her voice brittle. Her hands gripped the cold brass of the candelabra so tightly her knuckles were white. "Do you ever truly feel free, even in your mind, or is the cage too well defined?" He paused, holding a heavy mallet motionless in his hand. He looked at her, not with the subservience of a house slave, but with the profound, piercing melancholy of a philosopher trapped in a mechanic's role. "The mind may roam, mistress, but the body remembers the iron," he answered, his gaze dropping slowly to the scarred wood floorboards which symbolized the limitations of his existence. "There is always the reminder, the weight of knowing that every word, every thought, every feeling belongs to another man." He put the mallet down with deliberate, painful care. The silence that followed was heavy, fraught with the immense gravity of the system that held them both captive. It was this shared, devastating understanding of captivity, her gilded cage, his iron chains, that finally dissolved the necessary barrier between them. She was starved for connection. He, for recognition of his personhood. In the dim, isolated library, their loneliness converged. As Caleb adjusted the collar of his simple linen shirt, preparing to leave the cool sanctuary for the harsh reality of the slave quarters, a deeply felt wave of sorrow and connection washed over him. This was the true danger of intellect. It allowed for connections that the world would violently punish. And as I detail this precarious, terrifying deepening of an illicit bond, I pause to ask you, the viewer, who is journeying with us through the suffocating tension of Blackwood Plantation, from what city and country are you accompanying this narrative? Please leave a like if the weight of this historical moment resonates with you, and subscribe to ensure you don't miss the steps that lead to the tragic unfolding of this fate. Charlotte took a shuddering breath, her eyes closed for a brief, desperate moment. When she opened them, she took 2 steps towards him, moving past the tools and the books, crossing the last remaining distance of social demarcation. She did not touch him, but she was now undeniably within the circle of his personal space. The air between them crackled, charged with 8 months of unfulfilled yearning and intellectual intimacy. "I cannot bear the quiet any more, Caleb," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was a plea, an admission, and a terrifying invitation all at once. He stood taller then, the lines of his body taut. The moment stretched, agonizing and slow, until he inclined his head, accepting the terrifying shift in their shared reality, acknowledging the inevitable path they were now forced to walk together, a path paved with the crushing contradiction of their world. The months that followed, the initial, desperate confession in the library, transformed Blackwood Plantation from a place of sterile isolation into a minefield of exquisite, terrifying danger. Augustus Blackwood, perpetually concerned with profits and politics, remained away for extended periods, providing the critical, agonizing windows of opportunity. Yet his absence did not bring safety. It only meant the consequences of exposure would be delayed and thus exponentially greater. Their meetings became a careful dance through the architectural ghosts of the Greek Revival mansion. Sometimes it was in the suffocating heat of the conservatory, a glass enclosure attached to the back facade, where the humid air hung thick and heavy with the scent of wilting gardenias and sickly sweet, struggling jasmine. The light there filtered through the glass, and the broad, dusty leaves of the tropical plants offered visual concealment, but the acoustics were dreadful. Every rustle of linen, every barely audible whisper seemed magnified against the glass. Caleb would enter under the pretense of checking the irrigation system, his movements practiced and slow. Charlotte would arrive minutes later, claiming to be seeking the cooler air, though the conservatory was always the warmest, dampest part of the house. They never spoke carelessly. Their language was coded, their dialogue punctuated by long stretches of silence, where only their eyes communicated the desperation and the profound shared terror that defined their stolen moments. "The risk is too high, Caleb," Charlotte murmured one evening in late spring of 1844, her hand pressed against the cool, damp glass, condensation running down like silent tears. The western sky outside was a blaze of violent orange and bruised purple, the typical dramatic sunset of the Delta. Caleb stood near a large potted fern, his silhouette obscured by the fronds. He watched the shadows move on her face. "The risk has been present since the moment I first saw the truth in your eyes, mistress. A life without risk here is merely a different form of burial." He was no fool. He knew that the system was designed to crush any deviation. But the intellectual connection had evolved into a physical necessity, a rebellious assertion of their right to feel, to exist, that the sterile, loveless world of the plantation vehemently denied. For Caleb, the physical act was an affirmation of his humanity. For Charlotte, it was the first time in years she felt alive, not merely preserved. The fear, however, was a constant, tangible presence, like the oppressive moisture in the air. Each creaking floorboard, each distant cough from the kitchen sent a jolt of ice through Caleb's spine. He often lay awake for hours in his small, hot room in the slave quarters, listening to the night sounds, reconstructing every second of their interaction, searching for the flaw, the misplaced word, the telltale mark that would doom them both. By the early autumn of 1844, the season had cooled, but the tension had reached a fever pitch. Augustus Blackwood was due back from a long, complex trip to Charleston. One morning, just as the sun burned through the usual Delta fog, Charlotte summoned Caleb to the unused music room, a wing so far removed from the kitchen and main hall that its heavy velvet drapes remained perpetually drawn. The room smelled of mothballs and forgotten aspirations. Charlotte was waiting near the grand piano, her face pale, her movements hesitant. She did not look him in the eye. "I need you to fix the latch on the attic access, Caleb," she said, her voice dry and unnaturally steady. "A small job. Quickly." He approached, his senses immediately registering the anomaly. Her left hand was pressed tightly across her abdomen, a defensive, unconscious gesture. The tailored waistline of her dress, usually sharp and perfect, seemed slightly strained. Caleb knelt to examine the supposed broken latch on the small, almost invisible access door. He saw nothing wrong. He reached up, his fingers brushing the cool wood. "The latch is firm, mistress," he whispered. Charlotte took a shallow breath, her gray eyes filling with a mixture of terror and grim clarity. She looked around the dimly lit room, then leaned forward, her voice dropping to a fierce, desperate hiss. "It is not the latch, Caleb." It is me. I am with child. The words struck Caleb not as sound but as a physical blow. The blood drained from his face, leaving his mahogany skin stretched tight over the sharp angles of his cheekbones. The reality of the situation, the absolute unforgivable transgression, crushed the momentary freedom he had enjoyed. The child, the evidence, a living, breathing symbol of the breakdown of the entire social, economic, and moral framework of the antebellum South. He stood slowly, his mind racing through the horrific possibilities, the whipping post, the immediate sale to the deepest interior, or, most likely, an unseen execution in the dark swamps. For Charlotte, the fate was scarcely better: institutionalization, public ruin, or a forced, secretive abortion that would destroy her physically and spiritually. "How long, mistress?" he asked, his voice rough, barely functional. "Since the return of the summer heat." 6 months, perhaps more. I hid it. I prayed it was merely indigestion, the changes of age, but the doctor confirmed it yesterday. He attributes it to the stress of Augustus's absence. He is a fool, but a pliable one. She gave a brief, sharp, terrifying laugh that had no humor in it. "We must work quickly. Augustus returns in 10 days. They knew the horrifying truth. Augustus was sterile. This child, when born, would be undeniably Caleb's, though the features might be slight. The timing, the complete impossibility of the paternity, would expose them. Caleb looked at her, his expression a profound mixture of crushing fear and desperate protectiveness. "We must act as if the child is merely early, premature. It is the only narrative that can withstand scrutiny. You must appear sickly and stressed immediately, mistress. You must refuse food. Confine yourself to your room." Charlotte nodded, her eyes wide with relief that he hadn't dissolved into panic. They were partners in catastrophe now. This scene, where the weight of the entire world crashes down on two people who dared to seek solace, reminds us of the terrible price of defiance in a world built on injustice. As we delve further into the dangerous web they are forced to weave, I ask you, who are watching this profound historical drama, from what city and country do you accompany this journey through the shadowed past? Please let us know in the comments below. Leave your like if this tale of forbidden connection and crushing consequence resonates, and subscribe to follow how Caleb and Charlotte attempt to navigate the impossible choice that lies ahead. The frantic plotting began immediately, conducted in whispered fragments over the next week, disguised under the heavy pretense of Charlotte's sudden, debilitating illness. Mammy Judith, the elderly, silent witness to the Blackwood family's many secrets, was brought into the periphery of the plan. Mammy Judith did not need words. She had seen generations of forced choices and necessary lies. She merely looked at Caleb and Charlotte, her eyes deep and resigned, and agreed to assist in the necessary deception of a premature delivery. The stakes had never been higher, nor the walls of their prison more absolute. The life of a child, and the lives of its parents, now depended entirely on flawless performance and the continued blindness of the master. The birth of Thomas was an agonizing exercise in performance and concealment. Augustus returned to Blackwood Plantation 2 days before the delivery, bringing with him the heavy scent of cigars, city grime, and uncompromising authority. He was solicitous to Charlotte in the detached, proprietary way one attends to a valuable yet fragile asset. He accepted the doctor's assurances that the mistress was suffering from nervous exhaustion due to the isolation. The boy was born in late November 1844, during a storm that swept inland from the Gulf, cloaking the plantation in sheets of cold rain and rattling the windows like the restless ghosts of the Delta. The tempest was a perfect collaborator, masking the cries of the mistress and the intense, hushed activities within the house. Mammy Judith managed the delivery, her hands skillful and ancient. The doctor, Patterson, was kept in the dark about the exact due date. He was merely informed of the sudden, alarming labor. When the child finally emerged, small, light-skinned, and undeniably the son of Charlotte Blackwood, Mammy Judith's deep sigh of relief was barely audible above the howling wind. The mixed heritage was subtle, requiring careful, immediate damage control. He is small, Augustus. So very small, Charlotte whispered, playing the role of the terrified mother perfectly when Augustus was allowed to view the child, swaddled tightly and presented in dim candlelight. Augustus, discomforted by the fragility and the sheer biological reality of the infant, merely nodded stiffly. A weakling, but legitimate. See to it, Charlotte, that he survives. He did not look closely. The sight of blood and new life repulsed him. The critical phase followed, the disappearance of the evidence. Caleb, disguised by the dark and the confusion of the storm, waited in the stables. Mammy Judith, under the guise of finding a suitable wet nurse from the field hands, executed the second part of the plan. Thomas, the son of the master's wife and the house slave, was placed into the care of an enslaved woman named Martha on a remote corner of the plantation, a woman recently bereaved of her own infant. The arrangement was presented as a necessity due to Charlotte's continued delicate health and inability to nurse. Thomas would be raised believing he was the son of Martha's sister, adopted into the enslaved community, but receiving better care and nutrition due to the master's fake benevolence and the mistress's charity. This strategy was horrifying, but vital. The child was physically close enough to be secretly observed, yet safely sequestered from the close scrutiny of plantation life and the dangerous comparison to the master's features. Caleb saw his son once before the boy was taken away, a fleeting glimpse of a tiny, perfect fist and the dark tuft of hair under the lantern light. It was a searing, painful moment of pride and loss. The knowledge of the boy's existence, secured at such a terrible cost, became a secret pulsing organ within Caleb's chest, a vulnerability that now defined his every movement. With Thomas successfully hidden, the crisis with Charlotte passed, leaving an exhausted, deeply shaken woman in its wake. But the reprieve was short-lived. The next challenge came from an entirely different quarter, Eleanor. Eleanor Blackwood, the rebellious daughter, had watched the entire performance with a cold, almost scientific detachment. Eleanor spent her days observing the minutiae of the household, a habit born of boredom and a simmering rage against her father. She had noticed the frequency of her mother's visits to the library before Augustus's return. She had seen the subtle, silent communication between Charlotte and Caleb, a shared tension, a rapid deflection of the eyes. She had registered the unnatural timing of her mother's pregnancy and the curious lightness of the newborn's complexion. Eleanor did not confront her mother directly. That would be messy and emotional. Instead, she chose to use her knowledge as a subtle, corrosive power. She found Caleb in the carriage house during a period when Augustus was back in Natchez. The air in the stable was warm and dusty, thick with the scent of hay and horse sweat. Caleb was meticulously repairing a broken spoke on a wagon wheel, his brow furrowed in concentration. Eleanor stood near the stall of her favorite mare, stroking the animal's velvet nose, her expression languid and deceptively careless. "My mother looks much better now that the little one is settled," she commented, her voice perfectly pitched to seem casual. "It must be a comfort to her to know the name will continue." Caleb's hands did not falter, but the plane slipped a hair, leaving a minuscule divot in the wood. He knew she was probing. He kept his gaze fixed on the wheel. "The mistress's health is a blessing, Miss Eleanor." Eleanor smiled, a sharp, knowing curve of her lips that made Caleb's blood run cold. She wore a riding habit of deep emerald green, which seemed to emphasize her striking, almost defiant beauty. "Yes, a great blessing. It is so interesting, Caleb, how sometimes when one is forced to rely on others for strength, one finds true affection, isn't it?" She paused, then added, her voice dropping to a seductive low murmur, "affection that the cold patriarch fails to provide." This was it. Not direct blackmail, but a declaration of knowledge, a chilling recognition that the boundaries were porous, that the crime had been witnessed. Eleanor was not seeking to expose her mother. Not yet. Her motivation was complex. She despised her father's authority and saw her mother's transgression as an ultimate act of rebellion, a path she found morbidly fascinating. But more profoundly, Eleanor was suffering the same profound isolation as Charlotte had. She was a valuable commodity, waiting to be sold into an advantageous, equally loveless marriage. She was desperate to feel the same illicit power, the same sense of breaking free that her mother had found. Over the next few months, in early 1845, Eleanor began a campaign of subtle emotional manipulation, leading Caleb into the same deadly trap. It began under the guise of tasks, requesting repairs to the small, remote pigeon loft, needing help carrying heavy tack from the cellar, or requiring him to wait in the deserted west parlor after supper to finalize measurements for a new armoire. In these isolated moments, Eleanor would speak not of books or philosophy, but of her future, a suffocating procession of formal balls and prearranged marriage contracts. She would look at Caleb, her eyes sharp and hungry, searching for the same reflection of shared defiance she had detected between him and her mother. "I am to be married to Mr. Davidson's son, perhaps by the end of the year," she said one humid afternoon in the tack room, her back to the open door, the smell of oiled leather surrounding them. Her fingers traced the pattern of the stitching on a saddle. "A handsome, wealthy brute whose only interest is his stable, just like my father. I will trade one form of cold iron for another." Caleb stood against the whitewashed wall, his body rigid, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He understood the implied choice: succumb to her desperation and participate in her rebellion, or reject her and risk the immediate exposure of his secret relationship with Charlotte. She held the fate of Thomas and his own life in her hands. The power imbalance was absolute. Eleanor, the white daughter of the master, saw in Caleb not a man, but a devastatingly effective tool for rebellion, a potent symbol of transgression. He was terrified, weary, and trapped in a web of forbidden desires and unavoidable demands. To refuse was death. To acquiesce was to deepen the abyss. Under the oppressive, unrelenting weight of her silent threat and the agonizing knowledge that he was protecting his son's existence, Caleb finally capitulated to the demands of the daughter, in the same way he had succumbed to the loneliness of the mother. The air grew heavy with the promise of summer and disaster. By late 1845, Eleanor, too, was with child, and unlike Charlotte's careful concealment, Eleanor, perhaps out of willful defiance, perhaps due to the faster progression, found it impossible to hide the swelling evidence of her transgression. The master's daughter was carrying a child that the entire Delta community would soon notice. The silence that had saved Caleb and Charlotte was about to be shattered by the undeniable visibility of Eleanor's expanding reality. The late autumn and early winter of 1845 brought no relief to Blackwood Plantation. Instead, a brittle, dangerous cold descended upon the Delta, freezing the surface tension of the escalating crisis. Eleanor's condition became progressively harder to disguise. She stopped wearing the tight corsets her father insisted upon and began favoring loose, high-waisted muslin dresses, claiming the fabrics were warmer. But the truth was there, undeniable to anyone who possessed the capacity for observation. Charlotte, recovering from her own harrowing experience and consumed by the necessity of upholding the fragile lie of Thomas's early birth, was the first to realize the full scope of Eleanor's folly. The discovery did not bring anger, but a profound, sickening resignation, the understanding that the same deadly necessity that had consumed her had now, through her example, corrupted her daughter. One afternoon, Charlotte found Eleanor in the upstairs sitting room, attempting to read a novel, but merely staring blankly at the page. The room was cold, the fire in the grate barely lit, and the wan winter light highlighted the shadows under Eleanor's eyes and the subtle, telltale curve beneath the fabric. Charlotte sat opposite her daughter, setting down her embroidery basket with deliberate, quiet finality. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic creaking of the old house settling. "Eleanor," Charlotte began, her voice devoid of accusations, steeped only in sorrow. "You are wearing the maternity garments I discarded last year. They do not hide the truth." Eleanor flinched, not in surprise, but in a weary acceptance that the final, necessary confrontation had arrived. She placed the book in her lap and looked up, her expression a strange mixture of youthful defiance and deep-seated misery. "You managed to hide yours," Eleanor retorted, her voice low and challenging. "I am merely less skilled at the performance, mother. Or perhaps I choose not to live in fear of him. This is not rebellion, child. This is ruin, Charlotte said, leaning forward. Do you understand the consequences? Do you know what Augustus will do when he realizes? And when he knows who? Eleanor's pale eyes were sharp. I know exactly who, and so do you, Mother. You set the precedent. You showed me that freedom existed, even in this suffocating place, by taking what was forbidden. She paused, the full, devastating weight of her words sinking in. And I did it in part because I knew you were doing it. If my mother can find real affection and defy the brute that owns us, why should I not? This was the complex subtext that gutted Charlotte. Eleanor had not acted out of lust or simple pique, but out of a desperate, twisted mirroring of her mother's search for autonomy. Charlotte had sought connection. Eleanor had sought vengeance against her father through the ultimate transgression. The focus of their terror, Augustus Blackwood, was due back from a fortnight in the capital. The winter air felt brittle, ready to crack under the slightest pressure. The moment of discovery was as formal and chilling as the plantation's columns. Augustus returned in the evening, demanding dinner be served promptly. It was a cold, quiet night in February 1846. The Blackwoods gathered in the dining room, a long, cavernous space where the mahogany table reflected the silver and the wavering light of the candles. The air was thick with the scent of roasted mutton and polished metal, overlaid by an atmosphere of profound, frozen tension. Augustus, 48, rigid and impeccably dressed, sat at the head of the table. He spent the first 10 minutes recounting the tedious details of a new tariff on cotton, his voice booming slightly in the high-ceilinged room. He glanced from his wife to his daughter, expecting the usual mask of polite attention. But Eleanor was not masked. She sat hunched slightly, pushing a piece of meat around her plate, her skin sickly pale under the candlelight. She lifted a handkerchief to her mouth, stifling a wave of nausea. Charlotte sat across from her, rigid, her eyes fixed on the silver arrangement, refusing to look at either her daughter or her husband. Caleb was serving the wine. He moved like a ghost, his hands shaking imperceptibly as he carefully filled Augustus's heavy crystal glass. He wore the usual livery, pristine white gloves emphasizing the dark skin of his wrist. Augustus, concluding his discourse on tariffs, finally turned his full, cold gaze on his daughter. Eleanor, he stated, his voice flat, dangerously devoid of emotion. You have been unwell. The servants tell me you look unwell. Eleanor managed a weak smile. The change in weather, father. Perhaps a lingering cold. Augustus did not accept the lie. His eyes, keen and ruthless when they were not blinded by his own vanity, tracked the curve of her body beneath the loose dress. He then glanced at Charlotte, whose own confinement had occurred just over a year prior. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. He looked around the table, the silence now deafening, broken only by the slight clink of Caleb setting down the silver wine cooler. A persistent illness that seems to affect only the women of this house, Augustus remarked, slowly picking up his heavy silver fork. He fixed his gaze on Eleanor, the fork hovering motionless halfway to his plate. His voice dropped, suddenly low and lethal. Tell me, daughter, are you with child? Eleanor choked slightly, covering her mouth with her hand, unable to speak, the lie freezing in her throat. Augustus shifted his terrifying attention to Charlotte. And you, madam? Your son was born small and early, an explanation I accepted with a weary sigh. But now your daughter suffers from the same ailment. He put the fork down, the heavy sound echoing like a gunshot. His eyes narrowed, moving deliberately from Eleanor to Charlotte, and finally settling on the only other male presence in the room, Caleb, who was standing frozen behind Augustus's chair, holding the silver platter steady, his knuckles white against the metal. Augustus's eyes were not filled with rage yet, only cold, terrifying calculation. He did not need to ask the obvious question, the shared, terrified stillness of the three people before him screamed the answer. The truth of the lineage, the terrible coincidence, and the identity of the progenitor snapped into place for the plantation owner with chilling speed. Augustus leaned forward, his massive frame radiating controlled menace. He addressed the room, but his gaze was locked on Caleb's reflected image in the polished mahogany tabletop. "How many, Caleb?" Augustus whispered, his voice dangerously soft, like the first crack in a winter dam. "My wife and my daughter. Tell me how many are yours." Caleb did not speak. His chest was heaving beneath the immaculate livery. He merely lowered his eyes, acknowledging the end of the impossible charade. The sound of the wind outside seemed to fade into a hollow roar, amplifying the deadly, inevitable silence that had finally fallen upon Blackwood Plantation. The structure of their world was about to collapse entirely, pulled down by the weight of two forbidden lives. The silence that followed Augustus Blackwood's whispered demand was not empty. It was filled with the crushing weight of institutional power and personal betrayal. The candle flames seemed to shrink, casting deeper, more predatory shadows across the dining room. Caleb remained motionless behind his master's chair, the silver platter a cold, useless shield. He could feel the heat radiating off Augustus's rigid back, a palpable promise of violence. Augustus did not need confirmation. Caleb's bowed head and the absolute terror radiating from both Charlotte and Eleanor were sufficient. The patriarch slowly stood up from the table, his chair scraping loudly across the polished floor, a sound that finally broke the hypnotic tension. He didn't scream or rage. He did something far worse. He became entirely methodical. He waved a dismissive hand toward Caleb, not even meeting his gaze. "Remove yourself, slave. Go to the stable loft. Do not leave it. Wait." Caleb, recognizing the small window of time before the inevitable torture and execution began, moved with a speed born of pure survival instinct. He did not look at Charlotte or Eleanor, who were now sobbing silently, their heads bowed. He simply vanished through the service door, leaving the three Blackwoods alone in the shattered reality of the dining room. The next 72 hours were defined by a brutal internal investigation conducted entirely by Augustus. He confined his wife and daughter to separate rooms in the West Wing, sealing the household under a blanket of chilling secrecy. He interviewed Mammy Judith, Dr. Patterson, and select older field slaves who might have witnessed the sequestration of the first child, Thomas. Mammy Judith, questioned in the suffocating privacy of Augustus's study, a room filled with the smell of leather and unyielding authority, played the role of the loyal servant perfectly. She confirmed that Thomas was a sickly, premature child, a product of the mistress's stress, and that she had organized his care with Martha, the wet nurse. Her testimony was flawlessly delivered, her eyes never leaving the floor. She did not mention Caleb. Augustus, blinded by his own assumptions about the fragility of white women and the strength of his own bloodline, despite the secret, clung to the premature narrative for the first pregnancy, though his belief was deeply shaken. But Eleanor's pregnancy was different. It was too far along, too visible, too close to the first incident. When Eleanor was questioned, she exhibited a strange, defiant recklessness. She refused to name Caleb directly, instead spewing venom at her father. "I only sought a life I could choose, father. You would sell me off like an animal to the highest bidder. If mother can find solace outside your cold hands, then why shouldn't I? I chose to defy you. I chose silence." Augustus roared, the sound bouncing off the walls of the study. He grabbed her arm with an iron grip. "You chose degradation. You chose a beast. Do you understand the stain you have placed on the Blackwood name?" The investigation confirmed two horrifying, intertwined realities for Augustus. His wife and daughter had both betrayed him, and both had done so with the same man. His secret shame, his infertility, was now exposed not to the public, but to the women he controlled and, crucially, to Caleb. The final, irreversible proof arrived in late spring of 1846, when Eleanor was delivered of a daughter, Sarah. The child was born at the plantation's remote overseer's cottage, the birth handled in total secrecy by Dr. Patterson and Mammy Judith, who were now deeply entrenched in the Blackwood conspiracy. Dr. Patterson, a man whose ethics had long been compromised by the planter class, recorded the child's birth as a stillbirth, listing the mother as unknown. When Augustus was shown the infant, the undeniable visible features of her mixed heritage obvious even in the dim light, the last vestiges of denial crumbled. The child Sarah carried the unmistakable signs of her paternity, making any public lie impossible. Augustus retreated into a private chamber for 2 days, refusing all sustenance, his mind a battlefield of pride, rage, and agonizing practicality. He faced a moral and practical dilemma that threatened to destroy not only his family but his social standing, the one thing he prized above all else. Dilemma 1: Exposure and Vengeance. He could publicly flog or execute Caleb and potentially kill the 2 children and permanently confine his wife and daughter. This would satisfy his rage, but the public scandal of the mistress and the daughter carrying the children of a slave would ruin the Blackwood name forever, leading to social exile and financial instability. The revelation of his own sterility would be the final unbearable humiliation. Dilemma 2: Cover-up and internal exile. He could execute Caleb in secret and then claim both his wife and daughter suffered from incurable nervous disorders, effectively removing them from society. This protected the Blackwood name but forced him to live a permanent, terrifying lie, surrounded by his enemies, the 2 surviving women and the 2 hidden children. Augustus was not a man of conscience, but he was a man of immense pride and fear. The thought of being the object of the entire Delta's cruel whispers was intolerable. The public facade was everything. He chose the cover-up. It was a choice rooted not in mercy, but in profound moral cowardice. The decision was put into immediate, chilling action. Charlotte was declared permanently ill and delicate, confined to the east wing of the plantation house, allowed only the company of Mammy Judith and the occasional superficial visit from her husband. She was forced to sever all direct contact with Thomas, who continued to be raised under the false identity in the quarters, a painful shadow just beyond the walls. Eleanor, whose defiance was now a ticking clock of future rebellion, was announced as having been sent north to a specialized convent for a debilitating condition. In reality, she was relocated to a remote, seldom used farm property owned by the Blackwoods in the foothills of upstate Mississippi. Sarah, the infant daughter, went with her, raised as Eleanor's adopted ward, the daughter of a distant, deceased cousin. This move eliminated the immediate threat of scandalous comparison and isolated the problem entirely. And Caleb, the man who had fractured the foundation of Blackwood Plantation. Augustus knew he could not simply kill him. Murdering a skilled house slave, particularly one with known literacy and carpentry talents, would require explanation, and the whispers would eventually follow. Moreover, Augustus, in his twisted, bitter logic, found the simple execution too clean an end. He wanted Caleb to simply vanish, utterly and completely, without leaving a body or a traceable rumor. This profound crisis, the realization that his social dignity mattered more than his personal vengeance, forced Augustus into the great, unexpected dilemma. He had to decide Caleb's fate without attracting attention. The decision he made, the complex internal exile and the hidden disposal of Caleb, would shock the community far less than the truth, but it would set the stage for the next, equally dangerous chapter. The stable loft, Caleb's temporary prison, was stiflingly hot and dark, smelling sharply of cured leather and dry hay. He sat on a pile of coarse burlap sacks for 3 days, listening to the muffled, terrifying silence of the plantation below. He knew the master was making his decision. Every hour was an eternity of anticipating the sound of heavy footsteps on the wooden ladder, the rasp of a gun cocking, or the cold, indifferent voice of an overseer demanding his presence at the whipping post. He did not fear death as much as he feared the forced confession that would expose Thomas and Sarah. On the 4th morning, just before dawn, a time when the Delta air was at its coolest and the plantation was caught in its deepest sleep, the door to the stable opened, not with a bang, but with a deliberate, quiet click. A shadow detached itself from the gloom, Augustus Blackwood. Augustus stood just inside the door, silhouetted against the weak, smoky light of the lantern he carried. He looked weary, his tailored coat wrinkled, his face etched with sleepless decision. He did not approach Caleb, who stood immediately, bracing himself. "You have caused the ruination of my house, slave," Augustus stated, his voice flat and profoundly tired, echoing slightly in the vastness of the stable. The shame you have brought upon the Blackwood name is incalculable. Caleb remained silent, his gaze fixed on a point just past the master's shoulder. He was prepared to accept any punishment, provided it was swift and did not involve the children. Augustus, however, was past the point of petty revenge. He was consumed by the logistics of damage control. I could break every bone in your body and scatter your pieces for the gators. That would satisfy my bloodlust, but that requires a public explanation, and Blackwood Plantation requires no further scrutiny. He lifted the lantern slightly, illuminating Caleb's face. You are literate. You are a skilled craftsman. You are an anomaly. And now you are an impossible problem. If I keep you, I risk your presence driving my wife and daughter further into madness. If I sell you south, the men who buys you will learn of your past, and the rumors will follow. Augustus paused, taking a slow, shaky breath. The decision he was about to reveal was born of pure self-preservation and a profound, secret act of moral cowardice. You will be sold, but not into further bondage, Augustus articulated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. I have arranged a deal with a man in Vicksburg, a traveling merchant. A quiet transaction. No paperwork linking you directly to this estate, save a simple bill of sale for transport. Caleb frowned, confusion briefly displacing the terror. A simple sale meant immediate relocation, but the master's tone suggested something more intricate. Augustus waved a hand in disgust. The merchant is a known contact for abolitionist networks operating near the Ohio River. Reverend Whitmore. He pays well for skilled men for their missionary work. He purchases slaves with the intent of transport and subsequent freedom papers under a long-standing, secretive agreement with certain northern churches. Caleb stared at Augustus, disbelief warring with a flicker of hope. Freedom. The word tasted impossibly sweet and terribly precarious. Why? Caleb finally asked, the single word hoarse. Because, Augustus hissed, stepping closer, his face contorted in bitter hatred, I cannot risk your execution attracting attention, and I cannot bear to look upon the man who has replaced me in my own bed and that of my daughter. You will disappear. You will take the money I give you and you will walk away, and you will never, never speak of this house, my wife, my daughter, or the 2 children you have sown here. Do you understand? Your freedom is bought at the price of your permanent silence. You will cease to exist for us. You will be a dead man walking far from Mississippi. Augustus reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch, tossing it onto the hay. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. Gold. Enough to reach the free states. Enough to start. Now move. The carriage waits on the service road. Mammy Judith has packed minimal clothes. Go. And may God damn your memory. Caleb moved quickly, scrambling for the pouch. He did not trust the offer. He knew it could be a trap, a way to lure him outside for an ambush. But the faint possibility of freedom, the desperate chance to ensure his children had one parent free to perhaps watch over them from a distance, was too compelling. Within the hour, Caleb was bundled onto a covered wagon, driven by an impassive white man he had never seen before. He did not look back at the distant mansion, its white column spectral in the pre-dawn light. He felt no triumph, only a deep, paralyzing sense of dislocation and loss. He was leaving his 2 children, Thomas and Sarah, behind the high, invisible walls of race and class, knowing he could never truly claim them. He was leaving the memory of Charlotte, locked away in her gilded prison. His life was saved, but his heart was severed. The journey north was arduous, secretive, and terrifying. Reverend Whitmore, a man with a thin, severe face and eyes that held genuine kindness, met Caleb in Vicksburg. Whitmore did not ask questions about the strange, highly priced transaction. He simply looked at Caleb's educated hands and understood the complexities of the Deep South secrets. Whitmore oversaw Caleb's passage up the Mississippi River on a series of cargo boats, hidden among barrels and dry goods, enduring the cold and the constant gnawing fear of discovery. Upon reaching the relative safety of the Ohio border, Whitmore gave Caleb his official, if sparsely detailed, freedom papers stamped in an abolitionist-friendly Ohio County courthouse. "Go to Cincinnati," Whitmore instructed, pressing a small, worn Bible into Caleb's hand. "There is a community there. They need builders. You are free now, son. Build a life worthy of the second chance you were given." Caleb, now 30 years old, stepped onto the soil of Ohio. The cold, firm earth, a stark contrast to the thick, oppressive mud of the Delta. He was free, but the freedom was bought with the heaviest chains of all, silence and separation. He carried the ghosts of Blackwood Plantation with him, two hidden children defined by the system he had escaped. He was a carpenter, and his life's work had just begun, rebuilding a life on a foundation of unforgivable secrets. And as we witness Caleb walking away, the heavy weight of the past receding behind the dense fog of the Ohio River, we understand that freedom often comes not with celebration, but with profound sacrifice. If this intricate, tragic narrative of hidden choices and survival moves you, please take a moment to leave a like on this video. Tell us in the comments below from which city and country you are watching this complex tapestry unfold. And most importantly, subscribe to follow Caleb's journey and see how the fate of the two children he left behind will eventually intersect with his own hard-won freedom. Years later, Caleb settled in Cincinnati, Ohio, a bustling, muddy, and vibrant city on the north bank of the Ohio River, a recognized stop on the Underground Railroad. The year was 1846, and the city, though possessing its own currents of prejudice, offered a stark, exhilarating contrast to the suffocating rigidity of the Delta. The air was colder, crisper, and imbued with the energy of industry and free labor. He secured work almost immediately. His skills as a carpenter were exceptional, honed by years of demanding work on the fine finishes of the Blackwood mansion. He found employment with a German master builder who appreciated his precision and silence. Caleb did not seek out social circles. He rented a small, clean room above a cooper's in a busy, ethnically mixed neighborhood, its windows overlooking the constant flux of drays and wagons. His life was a study in methodical self-control. Every morning he rose before dawn, ate a simple breakfast of bread and coffee, and walked the mile to the workshop. He worked relentlessly, pouring his entire focus into the grain of the wood, the accuracy of the measurements, the structural integrity of the frames he built. The physicality of the labor was a deliberate attempt to wear out his body and quiet the constant internal roar of memory and anxiety. He saved every penny. His gold pouch, provided by Augustus, remained untouched, a constant, ugly reminder of the transaction that had secured his life at the cost of his family. He intended to use it only if he needed to orchestrate a return or intervene in a crisis, a mission he knew was nearly impossible. The core of Caleb's existence was the crushing weight of the secret he carried. He never allowed himself to forget Thomas and Sarah. He learned to read the newspapers meticulously, scanning every edition for news from Mississippi, particularly any mention of the Blackwood name or any oblique reference to events near the Natchez district. The process was agonizing. Every article about a fire, a death, or a public function sent his heart plummeting. The first few years were the hardest. He was free, yet the freedom felt hollow, purchased by a terrible sacrifice. The guilt was a constant companion, whispering that he had abandoned the children, that the true price of his liberty was their continued bondage or exile. He often walked down to the muddy banks of the Ohio River after work, watching the water flow south, the geographical cord that still connected him to Mississippi. He would stand there, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, imagining the Delta heat, the smell of the cotton dust, and the faces of Thomas and Sarah, whom he barely knew. His growth was subtle but profound. He was now operating entirely as a free man, negotiating his wages, purchasing his own materials, engaging with other artisans as an equal. The subservient posture and the reflexive "yes, sir" slowly eroded, replaced by a quiet, measured confidence. He discovered the profound dignity of ownership, of his own labor, his own time, his own name. He began to teach himself advanced architecture, sketching complex roof lines and facade designs late into the night by the meager light of a lamp. He found solace in a small, organized abolitionist church, primarily black, and focused on education and self-improvement. The Reverend there noticed Caleb's quiet strength and his literacy. Caleb never spoke of his past, only that he was a freedman from Mississippi. He began teaching basic arithmetic and writing to children and other recently freed or escaped slaves on Sunday afternoons. This work provided a crucial anchor, a way to contribute to the future that his own children deserved, even if they could not directly benefit from it. One evening, 4 years after his arrival in Cincinnati, in the autumn of 1850, Caleb received a stark reminder of the long reach of the South. The Fugitive Slave Act was passed, violently expanding the power of slave catchers into the free states and turning every citizen into a reluctant agent of the Southern system. The atmosphere in Cincinnati instantly shifted from cautious freedom to pervasive fear. His freedom papers, once a talisman, now felt inadequate. He realized that even across the river, he was not truly safe. The fear, ironically, fortified his resolve. He redoubled his efforts, building a reputation for meticulous honesty and superior workmanship. He used his savings not only for his upkeep but also to aid the network, providing sturdy hidden compartments and reinforced doors in the houses that served as safe havens. His carpenter's skill, once used to maintain the grandeur of the slave system, was now used actively to dismantle it, one hidden wall and one reinforced floor at a time. This was his penance, his resistance, and his quiet devotion to the future he prayed his children would one day inhabit. By 1855, Caleb had saved enough to start his own small carpentry business. His sign, simply bearing the name C. Blackwood, hung proudly over his modest shop, a small, silent act of reclaiming a name that was not truly his, but belonged to the system that had created him. He was 40 years old, hardened by labor and tempered by loss. He was a pillar of his small community, respected and profoundly private. He had built a fortress of competence and silence around himself. The growth had been paid for by the enduring, terrible knowledge that somewhere far away in the humidity of Mississippi, 2 teenagers, Thomas and Sarah, were growing up, strangers to their own father, defined by the lies told to protect them. The time of quiet growth was ending. The storm of the nation and the storm of his past were gathering strength, ready to collide. The year 1859 descended upon Cincinnati with the heavy foreboding of national crisis. The air crackled not only with the increasing political fervor surrounding abolition but also with the bitter chill of a particularly harsh winter. Caleb, now 43, was weathering the storm of national unrest from the solid foundation of his successful carpentry shop. He had built his business on reliability, and his quiet competence was a shield against the rising tide of fear and uncertainty. But the past, as Caleb knew, never truly stayed buried. It merely waited for the moment of greatest vulnerability to rise again. The great challenge arrived not through a slave catcher or a political decree, but through a thin, almost invisible channel, a letter. One bitterly cold afternoon in December, the kind of day when the gray sky seemed to press down on the city, a young boy from the local post office delivered a missive to Caleb's shop. The paper was heavy, cream-colored stationery, and sealed with a recognizable, though slightly faded, coat of arms, the crest of the Blackwood family. Caleb was in the middle of planing a massive slab of walnut. He immediately stopped, the rhythmic shush of the plane dying in the shop's silence. His heart began to hammer against his ribs with a savage, cold intensity. He wiped his hands meticulously on a rag, a simple, necessary act, a pause before confronting the absolute terror of contact after 13 years of silence. He opened the letter with trembling fingers. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and immediately recognizable, Eleanor's. Caleb walked to the single window, holding the letter to the faint light filtering through the dust-streaked pane. The letter was dated 2 weeks prior, from the remote property in upstate Mississippi. The first lines confirmed his deepest fear and his profoundest loss. Caleb. I know you swore silence, and I honored that. But the silence has ended here. Augustus died 3 months ago, quickly and without the dignity he believed he deserved. A sudden cerebral hemorrhage while inspecting a shipment in Natchez. He is gone. Caleb leaned against the workbench, the rough wood digging into his back. Augustus, the cold patriarch, the architect of their silence, was dead. It offered no immediate comfort, only a jarring sense of finality. He continued reading, his eyes racing across the familiar, flowing script. Mother Charlotte preceded him. She passed 5 years prior, 1855. She never recovered from the confinement, nor the loss of her son. She died in the East Wing, believing Thomas was safe, but unable to truly hold him. I maintained the lie, but she carried the sorrow of her separation until the very end. The news of Charlotte's death struck Caleb with the force of delayed grief. He had loved her, not passionately perhaps, but with a deep intellectual affection and shared desperation. She had died a prisoner, separated from their son. The guilt he carried suddenly swelled into a crushing sorrow. He gripped the paper tighter, forcing himself to read the final, critical section. The children are growing. Thomas is 16, clever and kind, currently assisting the master's overseer, who is merely managing the property now. Sarah is 14, attending a private school in Memphis. I insisted on the education, using the guise of a cousin's inheritance. They are beautiful, Caleb. They are free of the shackles of ignorance, and soon, I pray, free of all chains. This was the core of the dilemma, the massive, overwhelming challenge Eleanor presented. With Augustus gone, the estate must be settled. I have been confirmed as the legal guardian of the remote property and of Thomas, who is still officially Martha's nephew, but I have brought him into the house staff here. I am selling Blackwood Plantation entirely to the Davidsons. I am cutting all ties. Sarah and Thomas are coming north with me. I have sufficient funds to secure our future in a place where the air is cleaner. The next paragraph was a direct request. A brutal demand for collaboration. I need your help, Caleb. I need you to meet us. We will be arriving in Cincinnati via riverboat in 2 weeks. I want the children to meet you. Not as their father. Never as their father. I cannot risk their futures or the potential legal ramifications, even here. But as an old, trusted family friend, a man who served the household well and who secured his own freedom through merit. A mentor. They need to see what freedom looks like. They need a quiet, strong male figure in their lives who is not a master. I have protected them from the truth of their parentage, and I believe we must continue this necessary deception. They are already free of the Blackwood name. They must now be free of the burden of our choices. Do not fail us, Caleb. I need you to be the lie that saves them. The letter dropped from Caleb's numb fingers onto the dusty floorboards. The shop was cold, but Caleb was drenched in sweat. The immediate relief that Thomas and Sarah were not only safe but educated and coming north was overwhelming. But it was instantly replaced by the terrifying complexity of the request. He had to become a meticulously crafted illusion. He had to meet his son and daughter, now teenagers, formed and real, and pretend they were strangers, children of another life. He had to become C. Blackwood, the successful free carpenter, not Caleb, the slave whose passion had nearly destroyed an entire plantation. The lie had saved their lives. Now the lie had to secure their future. His heart ached with the desire to embrace them, to tell Thomas about the philosophy books they shared in blood, to tell Sarah she inherited her intelligence from a man who learned to read in a stable. But Eleanor was right. The truth, however redemptive for him, was a legal and social anchor that could drag the children back into the dangerous currents of prejudice and the law. Caleb spent the next 2 weeks in a state of meticulous, agonizing preparation. He cleaned his apartment, purchased new, respectable clothing, and adjusted his demeanor. He practiced the smooth, confident posture of a successful northern businessman, purging the last physical remnants of his servitude. The challenge was immense, not merely protecting the children, but living a lie so deep and necessary that it became his new reality. He was about to come face to face with the two living consequences of his past. And he had to be ready to sacrifice the satisfaction of paternity for the assurance of their freedom. This was the ultimate reversal. The greatest act of love required him to deny his identity. The Cincinnati waterfront in January 1860 was a chaotic tapestry of mud, commerce, and cold, stinging air. Ice floes choked the gray waters of the Ohio River, and the massive paddle wheel of the arriving steamer, the Pride of Louisville, churned against the resistance, creating a thick, frothing wake. Caleb stood near the landing dock, impeccably dressed in a heavy wool coat, a discreet silk scarf knotted at his throat, and a new beaver hat pulled low against the wind. He was 44 years old, his face showing the honest wear of labor and internal stress, but his bearing was that of a man of substance and freedom. He had arrived an hour early, his nerves stretched taut. The dock was crowded with porters, steam whistles shrieked, and the stench of coal smoke and river water filled the air. Caleb ignored the bustling energy, his eyes fixed on the ship's gangplank, waiting for the first sight of the family he had built and lost. The moment the gangplank secured and the first passengers began to disembark, Caleb felt a chilling rush of adrenaline. He was about to confront the material reality of his past actions. Eleanor was among the first. She was now 36, but the years of internal exile and the strain of maintaining the enormous secret had aged her beyond her years. Her elegance remained, but it was sharper, more brittle, like antique glass. She wore dark traveling clothes and carried herself with the air of a woman who had fought a war and won, though the victory was costly. Caleb's eyes met hers across the distance of the crowded dock. Eleanor gave a single, tight nod, a clear signal of recognition and a sharp, silent reminder of their pact. Then came the children. Sarah stepped onto the dock first. She was 14, tall for her age, with Eleanor's pale gray eyes but set in a face that held the smooth, dark undertone of Caleb's lineage. She was slender, dressed in a sensible travel coat, clutching a satchel containing books. Her hair, dark and tightly braided, was adorned with a simple, respectable ribbon. She looked around the chaotic waterfront, not with fear, but with an intelligent, hungry curiosity. Caleb saw his own quiet thirst for knowledge reflected in her gaze. A moment later, Thomas emerged. 16 years old, broad-shouldered, and notably fair-skinned. He could almost pass as fully white, a legacy of Charlotte's background. He carried himself with the muscular grace of a young man used to physical labor, but his manner was studious, his focus serious. He wore a simple, well-made suit, a sign of Eleanor's insistence on his status. When Caleb saw Thomas, the breath seized in his chest. The boy was built like him, strong and deep-chested, but it was the small mannerisms that tore at Caleb, the way Thomas adjusted his collar, the slight furrow of concentration across his brow. They were uncannily familiar, gestures Caleb himself often made when faced with complexity. This was the moment of highest tension. Caleb had to navigate the next 3 minutes without betraying 13 years of forced absence and agonizing paternal pride. Eleanor moved towards Caleb, her hand outstretched in a formal, public greeting. "Mr. Caleb," she said, her voice clear and carrying, though her eyes were filled with desperate warning. "Thank you for coming. It has been many years since you departed Blackwood. I trust the journey was successful." Caleb took her hand, his own steadying through sheer force of will. "Miss Eleanor. The journey was long but profitable. I am glad to see you well and safely arrived in Ohio." He released her hand and immediately turned his focus to the children, carefully calibrating his expression to that of a benevolent, interested stranger. "And these must be Thomas and Sarah," he said, forcing a polite, unfamiliar warmth into his tone. Sarah looked up at him, her pale eyes assessing. "Mr. Caleb. Miss Eleanor has told us you were once a great support to the household. She says you are a master builder in the city." "I try to be, Miss Sarah. I build things that last," Caleb replied, fighting the overwhelming urge to reach out and smooth the hair from her brow. He noted the way she held her satchel tight, a person who valued her few possessions. I understand you're quite the student. Sarah nodded, a small, shy smile touching her lips. I intend to study nursing, sir. There's much healing needed in the world. Thomas stepped forward, his handshake firm and mature. It is an honor to meet you, Mr. Caleb. I have heard Miss Eleanor speak of your knowledge of mathematics and architecture. We are glad to be free of Mississippi, but I worry about finding employment in the North. Caleb met his son's eyes. A profound, gut-wrenching moment of connection and denial. He saw a flicker of his own soul reflected there, the quiet intelligence, the responsible nature. Cincinnati is a city built on hard work, Thomas, Caleb said, forcing the advice to sound professional, not paternal. He paused, looking around the bustling docks, the movement of commerce suggesting infinite possibilities. Your education is your greatest tool. You are capable of teaching. The new colored schools in the West End require educated men. If you show dedication, you will not only find employment, but you will build a community. Thomas's face brightened, a genuine, wide smile that illuminated his face. Teaching. That is an ambition I hold, sir. To create something better. Yes. The exchange was brief but devastatingly revealing. Caleb saw his children, educated, ambitious, moral, and free. They were everything he had dreamed they would be. Yet they were strangers, separated by the very lie that had preserved their opportunity. Eleanor stepped in, her voice cutting through the delicate, charged air. We must secure our trunks, Mr. Caleb. We will take rooms at the boarding house I reserved. Can you meet us tomorrow morning? I will be there at 10, Caleb confirmed, watching the three of them turn away, merging into the stream of disembarking passengers. He stood on the dock long after they vanished into the throng. The cold air did not pierce him. He was frozen from within. He had successfully performed the role of the old family friend. He had seen the future, Sarah the nurse, Thomas the teacher, a generation unburdened by the specific chains of Blackwood Plantation. But the sheer impossibility of the situation, the proximity of his children, and the agonizing, necessary silence was almost too much to bear. He walked away from the waterfront, heading back towards the empty warmth of his shop, burdened by the realization that his greatest act of love required him to live the most agonizing denial. The denial was a permanent sacrifice. The following morning, Caleb arrived punctually at the modest but respectable boarding house Eleanor had secured in a quieter section of the city. The meeting took place in the small, slightly cluttered parlor, smelling faintly of cold smoke and old lace. Eleanor dismissed Thomas and Sarah to unpack and immediately turned on Caleb, her face strained with the residual stress of the journey and the weight of their shared secret. You handled yourself perfectly yesterday, Eleanor stated, her voice low and tense, leaning in conspiratorially. But we must be clear, Caleb. The danger is not entirely behind us. Augustus's death complicates the inheritance but does not eliminate the potential for scandal, especially with the war approaching. Caleb sat opposite her, his hands resting lightly on his knees. The children are magnificent, Eleanor. Educated. Free. You have accomplished a miracle. I did what I had to do to survive, she corrected him sharply, and to give them a life that was not owned by the Blackwood name. But their freedom is built on lies. Lies we must maintain meticulously. The truth of their parentage, the miscegenation, the scandal involving both the wife and daughter, is enough to ruin us all, even in Ohio, and potentially draw the attention of legal opportunists. The complexity of the situation settled over them like a shroud. Eleanor, in her practical desperation, had managed to maneuver the children into freedom, but the full legal truth remained a potent weapon. What exactly did you tell them about me? Caleb inquired, his voice husky. The truth, edited for survival. You were a remarkably skilled slave, purchased by Augustus's father years ago. Your education was noted, and you worked closely with the family. When Augustus sold you, I insisted he ensure you were sold to a contact who would guarantee your freedom. I framed it as a subtle act of charity on my part, a necessary kindness to a loyal servant before the estate went to ruin. Eleanor's face was utterly devoid of self-praise. She was merely reciting the successful narrative. Caleb nodded slowly. It was a perfect cover story, using the accepted logic of the time, a paternalistic kindness from a white mistress to explain his extraordinary fate. And Thomas, he must suspect the difference in his status. His mother, Martha, was a field hand. Thomas believes his biological mother died shortly after birth, and Martha, who died 3 years ago, was his beloved aunt who raised him under the protection of the Blackwood household. He knows he was treated differently due to my mother's charity. Eleanor air-quoted the word with distaste, referring to Charlotte. He knows only that he has always been destined for more than the quarters. Sarah, on the other hand, knows she is adopted, the daughter of a distant, impoverished cousin I took in. The children have only vague, sanitized histories. We are their only living sources. The climax of their conversation arrived when Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes pleading with an intensity Caleb had never seen before. But the truth is, Caleb, I brought them here because I am finished. I have carried this lie for 15 years alone. I need you to be their connection to the past, but the one who validates the narrative of their freedom. I need you to show Thomas how to become a man in a free state. I need you to show Sarah that a man of color can be educated and respected. Oh, the immediate, overwhelming risk was Thomas's legal status. If Thomas was revealed to be the son of the mistress, his white ancestry was dominant. Yet the law of partis sequitur ventrum meant his mother's status as mistress was irrelevant. His father was a slave at the time of his conception, but due to his mother's protected status, the legal chaos was immense. Sarah, born to Eleanor, presented a clearer line of descent, but the scandal was ruinous. As they finalized the delicate logistics of the deception, a sudden, sharp rap on the parlor door made both of them jump. A moment later, Thomas stood framed in the doorway, his expression deeply serious, holding a newspaper. "Miss Eleanor, Mr. Caleb, forgive my interruption, but I found this paper downstairs, and I believe you should see it." The atmosphere, already taut, snapped. Eleanor quickly composed herself. "What is it, Thomas?" Thomas walked into the room, holding up the Cincinnati Gazette, his finger pointed to a section reporting on the intensifying political division. "It is about the possibility of war, ma'am. But more importantly, there is a small article here." He paused, his young face grave. "Mr. Davidson, our neighbor back home, you remember, the one who always claimed father cheated him on the cotton yield, he is suing the Blackwood estate." Caleb and Eleanor exchanged a glance of cold dread. Davidson was the neighbor who had always suspected the truth, the one who spread the initial, dangerous rumors. Thomas continued, oblivious to the terror he was causing. "He claims that due to irregularities in the management of the estate after Master Augustus's death, specifically the sudden sale of the main property and the movement of all the liquid assets, that he believes the estate is hiding debts. He's petitioning the court to open a full inventory and audit of all assets, including the ownership of the remote foothills property and the location of any wards or servants who were recently associated with the Blackwood name." The paper trembled slightly in Thomas's hand. This was the moment. Davidson, motivated by financial greed and long-held suspicion, was attempting to tear open the Blackwood secrets through the legal system. If an audit revealed the existence of Sarah, registered as a ward, and Thomas listed under vague terms, and if Davidson's suspicions about their parentage were confirmed through deposition, the entire delicate structure of their freedom would shatter. Their legal status, their freedom, and Caleb's life were hanging by the thinnest of threads. Eleanor rose, her face utterly white, her posture radiating controlled panic. "Davidson is an opportunist. He is trying to seize the land." Caleb looked at Thomas, the boy's innocent delivery of the deadly news a profound irony. The legal system designed to protect property was now closing in on the property, the children, who had achieved freedom. "We must move quickly, Eleanor," Caleb said, his voice flat, decisive. "The first thing they will audit is the sale of the enslaved persons. My Sale. The abolitionist contact. This was the ultimate challenge, not only protecting the children, but preventing Davidson's lawsuit from unraveling the very legitimacy of Caleb's freedom, which would in turn destroy the lie that protected Thomas and Sarah. If Caleb was proven to have been illegally transferred or given his freedom as part of a scandalous cover-up, his status, and by extension, the entire Blackwood narrative, would collapse. The revelation contained in the Cincinnati Gazette acted as a brutal catalyst. The danger was no longer abstract. It was personified by Mr. Davidson, a man whose avarice was capable of tearing down the entire legal and moral facade they had constructed. Eleanor, recognizing the immediate threat to Thomas's ambiguous freedom, acted with the swift, cold calculation of a true Blackwood. She secured a private meeting with a trusted, abolitionist-leaning lawyer in Cincinnati. The very next morning, Caleb accompanied her, maintaining the role of the successful, concerned family friend. In the lawyer's office, a quiet space smelling of leather-bound books and ink, Eleanor laid out the situation with chilling clarity, omitting only the true nature of Caleb's and the children's parentage. She focused purely on the legal threat, Davidson's attempt to seize the estate by claiming fraud and forcing an inventory, which could potentially expose the sensitive arrangements concerning Thomas and Sarah, who were now free persons in Ohio. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Finch, listened patiently, his fingers steepled under his chin. The greatest risk, Miss Blackwood, is the discovery of the underlying scandal, Finch concluded, adjusting his spectacles. If Mr. Davidson can prove the transfer of property was designed to hide an illegal transaction, say, an attempt to conceal assets or evade debt, he can succeed. But if the children's freedom is established legally and morally, their status is protected by Ohio law. Even if the Mississippi courts challenge the property sale. Caleb spoke, his voice measured. The greatest risk is the paper trail of the sale. My Sale. If Davidson investigates the records in Natchez, he will see I was sold to Reverend Whitmore for a suspiciously high price right before Augustus transferred the children's mother and my wife to remote confinement. He will deduce the cover-up and argue that my sale was an illegal disposal of evidence, not a simple commercial transaction. Eleanor gripped the edge of the mahogany desk. We cannot allow Davidson to depose Reverend Whitmore. He would be forced to reveal the nature of the transaction, and the full story would surely leak, placing Thomas and Sarah's free status in jeopardy. The immediate resolution required a two-pronged attack, legal defense in Mississippi against Davidson, and, more critically, the final and absolute legalization of Thomas and Sarah's freedom in Ohio before the Mississippi courts could claim jurisdiction over them as property of the estate. Caleb offered the ultimate solution, the one that required the final, most painful sacrifice of his identity. Thomas and Sarah need to be officially established as free citizens of Ohio with clear, documented employment and sponsorship independent of the Blackwood estate, Caleb stated firmly. He paused, looking at Eleanor, then at the lawyer. I will provide that sponsorship. I will use the capital I have accumulated, the gold Augustus gave me, to set them up. He looked directly at Mr. Finch, maintaining the facade of the benevolent mentor. I know of Thomas's ambition to teach. I will use my savings to purchase a small property in a thriving black neighborhood, renovate it into a schoolhouse, and install Thomas as the teacher. This makes him a property owner and a professional citizen, not merely an adopted servant from Mississippi. Eleanor's eyes widened, recognizing the generosity and the profound personal sacrifice of his entire savings. Caleb, that is your retirement. It is my insurance, Caleb corrected her quietly. If they are established as productive, independent citizens, Davidson's claim that they are merely runaway property of a bankrupt estate is weakened. Their status will be cemented by the strength of their position in the community. The plan moved forward with frantic speed, fueled by Caleb's urgency and Eleanor's legal maneuvering. Caleb liquidated all his investments, using the final, heavy gold pouch from Augustus as the down payment on a small, dilapidated commercial structure in the city's West End. He worked with a passion he hadn't felt since arriving in Cincinnati. Pouring his skills into the renovation, he personally reframed the walls, built sturdy desks, and installed large, light-filled windows. He was not merely building a school, he was building a sanctuary, a visible symbol of his children's freedom, funded by the very blood money that had secured his life. Thomas, under the guidance of Mr. Finch and Caleb, was quickly integrated into the local black community leaders. He was introduced as a brilliant, educated young man from the South who had been freed and sponsored by an abolitionist network. Thomas, unaware of the desperate nature of the crisis, embraced his new role with sincerity and pride. The schoolhouse, named the Phoenix Academy, was opened just 3 weeks before the final disposition of the Davidson lawsuit was due in Mississippi. The ceremony was modest but immensely significant. Thomas, looking proud and serious in a new black suit, stood at the front of the classroom, facing a dozen hopeful, attentive children. Caleb stood near the back, watching his son, begin the work of building the future. It was a profound reversal. The slave, who was forbidden education, had used the capital earned from his bondage to create a space of learning for his child. He had successfully transformed the shame and secrecy of his past into the solid, visible foundation of his children's future. Sarah, too, was secured. Eleanor, utilizing the remaining capital, purchased a respectable house near the new school, establishing a permanent, recognized residence. Sarah quickly secured an apprenticeship with a local midwife, moving one step closer to her goal of nursing. The final telegram from Mississippi arrived a week later. Davidson's suit failed. The Blackwood estate was deemed solvent, and the sale of the main plantation was upheld. The Mississippi court, eager to avoid a scandal that could touch upon the delicate issue of miscegenation and white honor, had dismissed Davidson's fishing expedition. The judge ruled that the estate had legally disposed of its human property prior to Augustus's death, citing Caleb's specific sale record to the abolitionist contact as proof of due diligence. The truth was protected. The lie had worked. Thomas and Sarah were officially, legally, and geographically free. Their existence cemented into the safe architecture of Ohio society. The cost was Caleb's anonymity and a profound, permanent denial of his own fatherhood. He had successfully built the world that Charlotte and Eleanor had risked everything for. The threat from Mississippi had been neutralized, leaving behind a silence far more profound than the one that had reigned at Blackwood Plantation. The Phoenix Academy quickly became a beacon of education in the West End. Thomas Blackwood, who retained the surname for anonymity, was revered as a brilliant, devoted teacher. Sarah, apprentice to the midwife, was known for her gentle demeanor and keen intelligence, preparing herself to tend to the physical wounds of a nation heading toward war. Caleb continued his life as the quiet, respected carpenter, Mr. Caleb, the generous family friend and mentor. He often visited the school, ostensibly to check the structure or bring a repaired piece of furniture. He would stand at the back of the classroom, watching Thomas lead the students through complicated arithmetic problems or discussing the history of the early republic. In these moments, Caleb did not see the child of a slave and a master's wife. He saw a free man, a leader, a testament to the sacrifice of 3 lives, Charlotte's loss, Eleanor's defiance, and his own perpetual silence. He and Eleanor settled into a strange, functional intimacy, the intimacy of co-conspirators and co-parents who could never admit their true roles. They often met in the evenings in Eleanor's parlor, discussing the children's progress, their futures, and the darkening political climate. "They are doing well, Caleb," Eleanor remarked one rainy evening, watching the droplets streak down the window pane. The room was warm, illuminated by a single, steady lamp. "Thomas is thriving. He is a natural leader. He speaks often of the wisdom you shared about building solid foundations." Caleb, nursing a cup of coffee, managed a slight smile. "He has the focus of his mother, Eleanor, and the strength of conviction." He never spoke of Thomas's resemblance to himself, nor of the small, deep-seated pain of watching Sarah grow up, her quiet, intense gaze often fixed on him, searching for something she couldn't name. The greatest act of love, they both silently agreed, was the denial of self. The truth of Caleb's paternity was a destructive secret. The lie of his mentorship was a constructive, protective reality. As the years advanced and the shadows of the Civil War deepened, Caleb continued his quiet mission. He taught Thomas the intricacies of managing finances, the importance of structural integrity in life as well as in carpentry, and the profound necessity of education. He provided Sarah with books on medicine and science, encouraging her fierce intellectual curiosity. They knew him as the man who had bought his freedom and built a life of dignity, the proof that the chain could be broken. The war came in 1861, shaking the foundations of the nation. Thomas, though legally exempt, became heavily involved in the abolitionist movement and eventually in Reconstruction efforts, establishing schools for freedmen across Kentucky and Tennessee. Sarah, true to her ambition, worked as a vital nurse in a Union hospital in Cincinnati, tending to soldiers of every color and creed, her quiet strength a source of comfort to the dying. They were fulfilling the destiny Caleb had prayed for, a future unburdened by the prejudice that defined their birth. Caleb watched them thrive, his role never changing. He saw them marry, Thomas to a sharp, educated woman from the northern community, Sarah to a young, idealistic doctor who worked tirelessly to serve the underserved. He attended the weddings, sitting in the pews as a respected elder, nodding politely as the children introduced him as Mr. Caleb, our dearest family friend. He held his grandchildren on his lap, told them stories of carpentry and construction, but never of the cotton fields, the fear, or the cold dining room in Mississippi where their grandfather had stood, waiting for his execution. In these quiet moments of observation, watching the free, educated, vital lives of his lineage unfold, Caleb found his bittersweet redemption. He had lost the right to the title of father, but he had secured the reality of their freedom. He was the root hidden beneath the soil, ensuring the flourishing of the tree. Caleb died in 1889 in Cincinnati, a respected, successful businessman at the age of 73. His death was peaceful, surrounded by the large, loving family he had helped to build, none of whom ever knew the full, terrible truth of his connection to them. His final instructions were simple. The small, heavy leather pouch containing the remaining gold pieces, the same pouch Augustus had thrown on the stable hay, was to be split equally between Thomas and Sarah, with a note merely stating, "This capital purchased your first breath of free air. Use it to fortify the future." He died without revealing the full truth of their parentage. Thomas and Sarah lived full, meaningful lives as free people, educated their own children, and contributed profoundly to the rebuilding of a unified America without the chains of slavery. The greatest act of love was allowing the past to remain buried, ensuring their future could flourish without the crushing weight of the historical and legal shame that no longer existed. Their success was the silent testament to the courage and sacrifice of three people who, in their desperate defiance, fractured the heart of the antebellum South. As we close this long, complex journey of sacrifice, hidden love, and hard-won freedom, we invite you to reflect on the quiet strength required to live a truth for the benefit of others. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, Roots of Fear, for more historical explorations of the hidden contradictions of the past. And finally, share with us, from what city and country are you watching this final, redemptive moment unfold? See you in next video.